This is the Canon M50 Mark II, a small APS-C mirrorless camera released in November 2020, equipped with a 24.2 megapixel APS-C sensor, an integrated flash, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, an electronic viewfinder, a flip-up touchscreen, and a dual-pixel autofocus with eye detection. I bought this camera 3 years ago. Here's what I like and I disliked about it. But first, let's start with a few specs. Like I said before, it's equipped with a 24.2 megapixel APS-C sensor. It's using the CMOS technology. Yes, CCD is no longer around, or maybe really rarely. Something I would like to mention is that EF and EFS lenses don't fit on the M50 because it's using a so-called EFM mount. It's smaller, but that restriction can be bypassed with an adapter ring. Being a mirrorless camera, it doesn't have an optical viewfinder, but a digital viewfinder. So basically, you can see everything on the screen in the viewfinder. The electronic viewfinder is equipped with a 0.39-inch OLED screen, so you have really nice contrast, saturation, and black. It has a resolution of 2,360,000 dots, 786,666 pixels, which would give you a resolution of around Full HD. Compared to some DSLRs like my Canon EOS 750D, it has a 100% coverage of its viewfinder and a magnification of around 0.72 times. Like I already mentioned, the advantages of an electronic viewfinder is that you can see everything on the screen in the viewfinder. So that can be really useful if you are, for example, in a really dark room and you want to adjust your camera and you don't want to light up everything or disturb the people around. You can set up the camera in the viewfinder, you can preview your pictures, or it's even really useful in daylight where the main screen maybe not be as visible because of the sun. So that little viewfinder is really useful in that case. Compared to some DSLRs, the ISO of the M50 can be boosted to 51,200. I can already say you that it's not usable at all. It's more like a marketing gimmick. Here are a few sample pictures from the M50. If you have seen my Canon EOS 750D long-time review, you might remember that I wasn't really satisfied with the autofocus. This drastically changed with the M50. It's really fast, precise, and I like it. It has eye detection, as I mentioned, so you always can be sure that the subject is going to be sharp. It's using, like on my Samsung Galaxy S20 Plus, the dual pixel autofocus technology. This camera has an autofocus system with 3,975 points, or 133 zones in picture mode. In video mode, it's a bit different. It only has 3,375 and 170 zones, which is still pretty good. If you want to shoot in manual, the camera offers focus peaking to help you focus manually. Compared to my EOS 750D I reviewed earlier, my M50 Mark II has a newer generation RAW format called CR3, which is Canon's 14-bit RAW format. In RAW, the camera can shoot up to 10 pictures in single-shot autofocus and 7 FPS in continuous autofocus mode, for around 10 frames in RAW and around 33 in JPEG. When it comes to the battery life, you can expect around 300 shots. What's worth mentioning is that it's not really easy to hold the camera with one hand, even with my small hands, because the body is pretty small, so it's easier to hold the camera with both hands. But it's due to its small size, so it can be an advantage because of the weight. You don't have such a heavy backpack, but it can be maybe a bit of a disadvantage when you have to handle the camera. But I can live with that because I have small hands, and if that bothers you, you can add a camera grip or a battery grip, and that could bypass the problem. Like on the EOS 750D is something I like about Canon cameras. They are just nicely placed and you can easily reach them with your fingers. Even in the dark, you can feel where they are. They control regularly used functions like autofocus. One is there to switch between the shutter speed and aperture in manual mode. Like my other camera, this one comes with app support. The app is called Camera Connect. It enables you to adjust your camera wirelessly, to use your device as a monitor or making bold long exposures. But on the M50, I don't think it was possible on the EOS 750D. If you put to bulb mode, you just press on the touch screen and then you don't have to hold the shutter button. But you can also do it via the app. You can also download your pictures from the camera, but be cautious if you shoot in RAW. They're only going to be downloaded in JPEG. They're going to be compressed and downloaded. So if you're shooting in RAW, use your lead and connect it to the computer, or if your phone has OTG USB on the go, you can use that. When it comes to video recording, the camera can shoot up to 4K, but it has a heavy crop, so I don't really use that. And the autofocus isn't that good because it loses the nice dual pixel autofocus. So for me, the 4K capability isn't that interesting, but I didn't buy the camera for its 4K capability. I just bought it because I wanted a nice upgrade over my phone. The camera can shoot in Full HD 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second and HD in 60 frames per second. But we don't really use that anymore, just if you want a smaller format, but then you lose in resolution. Can turn on enhanced stabilization, which combines the digital and optical OIS, the optical image stabilization. But something, sadly, it doesn't work with vintage lenses, and there is kind of a heavy crop when you enable enhanced stabilization. It would have been so great if you could have used that with vintage lenses which don't have optical image stabilization built in, but now it's not working when you put a vintage lens on it. That's a bit of a miss, but maybe there is a technical reason behind it, because maybe it uses the information from the OIS to use the digital image stabilization, but normally it's controlled by a gyroscope and it knows how you're moving the camera. If you plan to stream, for example, I can recommend you the Canon M50 Mark II, not the Mark I. Why, you would ask? Because the M50 Mark II can output out of its HDMI port a clean picture signal. What does that mean? That means that you don't see all the settings like the time, recording time, not the time, the settings and all the other things are burned into the screen. So that's an advantage from the Mark I to the Mark II, which is, in my knowledge, not possible for the first generation M50, but there might be a workaround for that. Try to press on the info button until all the settings on the screen are gone. I don't own any M50 of the first generation. I can't confirm you if that's going to work, but what I'm sure is going to work is if you're going to use the Canon EOS utility webcam software. So here you're going to connect your camera with a micro USB cable to your PC. The disadvantage compared to using a capture card over HDMI is that the picture is going to be of a lower resolution. But now that I have mentioned the Mark I, how do they differ themselves? What makes them different to the first version? What's the difference between the Mark I and the Mark II? The Mark II has an autofocus with less limitations. It works also in servo mode autofocus, which is only the case for one shot on the first generation M50. It works in picture and video mode, which is only possible for picture mode on the M50. It can detect eyes when they're further away compared to the first generation. The Canon M50 Mark I and Mark II have also a built-in live stream feature. I never used it so far, so I don't know how it works. A hotspot is still required, but you can use that by just making a hotspot with your phone. Even though both cameras have the same exact battery, the Mark I has a battery life around 235 pictures and the Mark II around 300 because it's better optimized than the first generation. Something I didn't like is that the silent mode is only available in scenic mode, which is an automatic mode. I would have loved if it would have been available in a semi or fully automatic mode. So basically you don't hear that click. It uses the electronic shutter, which I think is a missed opportunity. Why Canon did you do that? Was there a limitation when it comes to the technology, or were you just plain lazy and you wanted to make it artificially worse than it could have been? So what could that also be an advantage for? Why I would have loved it is it would reduce the shake when you shoot, for example, long exposures or HDI. Even if you're using the timer, it could make a little click, and if you could remove that, that would have been perfect. The camera has also many automatics like HDR, night mode, panning, and many more. Now let's compare the different ISO values in the different lighting scenarios. In this first set of pictures, captured at ISO 100. The lowest ISO value, we observe a remarkable low noise level. The daytime shots exhibits a really great sharpness and amount of details, rendering every blade of grass and tree leaf with crystal clarity. There was no noticeable noise or color artifacts. The evening shot captured at ISO 100 maintained a high level of details just like the day shot. However, there was a slight decrease in details in the areas of the trees. The noise levels are minimal. There are no noticeable color artifacts. These settings allows for a well-detailed image even in low-light conditions, showcasing that this is the setting to use when you really want the lowest noise. Here we can see that the colors are maybe a bit more muted and less happy, but that's because it was in the evening. Let's jump over to ISO 200. The picture taken at ISO 200 continues to deliver sharpness and details along with faithful color reproduction and excellent dynamic range. The noise was barely perceptible even in the shadows. There is almost no difference to ISO 100. In the evening picture, some noise starts to be visible in the grass, but that's still marginal. Despite both pictures being shot at ISO 200, the lower light conditions maybe compel the camera to amplify slightly the signal, introducing maybe a slight amount of noise, and maybe they appear a bit less crisp compared to the daytime shot. Now let's jump over to ISO 400. The daytime shot at ISO 400 maintains an excellent quality with sharpness, details, and accurate colors with a good dynamic range. Noise is minimal even in the shadows. In the evening picture at ISO 400, there was a slight softness noticeable when zoomed on the grass in the foreground. However, the softness is not too distracting and the overall picture quality is still good. I could not complain, it's still really usable. ISO 400, there's nothing to complain about. Now let's transition to the next ISO setting, ISO 800. The daylight picture at ISO 800 still provides a good picture quality with sharpness and details. Also, it's not as crisp as ISO 100. Color reproduction and dynamic range still remains good. Some subtle noise appears in the shadows, but it's not too distracting. The evening picture at ISO 800 starts to exhibit a reduced dynamic range. The daylight picture at ISO 1600 retains a reasonable level of details, but the colors become less accurate and some chroma noise becomes to be noticeable in the shadows. The gray still retains some definition, though it's not as crisp as lower ISO values. The overall contrast slightly diminished with less brightness brightness in the highlights and less darkness in the shadows. In the evening picture at ISO 1600, the picture appears soft, grainy, with some muted colors and reduced contrast. Noticeable chroma noise was visible in the shadows. The overall impression conveyed softness and some lack of details. The daylight shot at ISO 3200 is soft, grainy, with muted colors, but retains a unique atmosphere suitable for creative effects. But as I already told you, it's better to have a grainy and noisy picture rather than a blurry one. So I would still recommend using that, but not for every day. I would really, in situations you need it. That's how high I would go with this camera. The ISO 3200 evening shot also displays muted and desaturated colors due to the natural desaturation of colors in low light conditions. Overall, this picture appears soft and a bit blurry, with muted colors making it less usable than the daylight shot. Now we're gonna get into the higher ISO values. At ISO 6400, the image exhibits substantial grain and noise with diminished details. While colors remain decent, they were no longer that accurate. For ISO 6400 at night, the picture is grainy with inaccurate colors and not that many details are left. Now let's jump to the high ISO values with ISO 12800. The ISO 12800 daylight shot was noisy and grainy with minimal details and inaccurate colors. The night shot is worse because there's less light. I wouldn't recommend it because then you will get a really noisy picture. But maybe you can still use it for artistic purposes if you want to have noise or something. You just want to have noise in your picture, then it may be a good idea if you want having that in your picture. Now let's jump to the settings I wouldn't use. ISO 25600 daylight shot was extremely noisy and grainy with almost no details left, and the colors were noticeably muted and inaccurate. Lastly, we briefly examined the highest ISO value, 51200, which is not a native ISO value but an extended value which is achieved through software. ISO 25600, which is still really bad, and ISO 51200. ISO 25600 was already of low quality. This seems more to be a marketing gimmick than a practical option. If you consider buying this camera, it's worth noting that the Mark II version falls typically in the price range of around $600 to $700. It's quite a realization when I think back of my own purchase of my second generation 2 years ago. I paid around 540 euros, which makes it clear that I got a really good deal on that camera back then. If you're on the market for a new camera, my recommendation would lean towards the second generation. The first generation models are becoming hard to find and their prices are on par with the Mark II, especially when you're paying the same amount for a product with more limitations, which doesn't make too much sense for me. So if you have a choice, I would go with the Mark II without hesitation. On the other hand, if you're open to purchase a used camera, you will notice a notable price difference between the Mark I and the Mark II. If you can live with those limitations of the first generation compared to the second generation, you can save a few bucks. However, do keep in mind that irrespective of which version you get, Mark I or the Mark II, investing in a quality adapter for your lenses is a must. EFM lenses aren't as prevalent as EF lenses, and using a subpar adapter can adversely affect your autofocus speed and reliability. The adapter situation isn't a concern for you and you're in the market for a compact DSLM camera, I can recommend this camera because I love mine, I love using it. I always had a great experience using mine. It hasn't given me any issues, especially compared to my EOS 750D. You already know that story if you watched that review. In the case you're looking for even cheaper cameras from $500 down to $100, I made a playlist I'm gonna link down below. Keep in mind that maybe the prices have changed since I made that video. I hope you liked this review. I'm happy to be back and making videos. Of course, a subscription would be snaptastic. I hope to see you in the next one and take care of yourself.